Welcome to Fundamentals of Macroeconomics. Today we will be creating the macroeconomic model. We need to link GDP, inflation, and interest rates all together in the same model. We're going to build a tool to describe the entire economy. This is a short-run macroeconomic model. Remember, models are an abstract representation of reality. As always with any graphical representation, take note of the axes. Whatever shock we throw at the economy, you'll know how the model functions, whether or not that shock takes place on an axis or off the axis. We need to pay attention on which shocks are going to shift which curve. This is going to be a simple yet powerful tool to help us decide the policies that fix the world. Our model needs to link the GDP and unemployment rate, the real interest rate, and all of the prices in the economy, a measure of inflation. The reason we single out the real interest rate from the other prices is because it's the most important price of all the prices in the economy. It is the opportunity cost of spending. It helps us make trade-offs between tomorrow and today, and thus affecting the real interest rate is a powerful tool to affect the macroeconomy today. So let's go through it. What happens to the economy when interest rates fall? Higher interest rates means consumer credit is more expensive, we will consume less. Additionally, the opportunity cost of consumption is higher. A household gets a higher return from savings with higher interest rates, so they'll save more and consume less. Investment decisions are very sensitive to interest rates. Nearly all investments are made on loans. Higher interest rates, more expensive loans, less profitable investment opportunities. Government purchases are likewise sensitive to interest rates. We often have a government spending deficit, therefore they rely on the bond market to pay for government expenditures. Higher interest rates means they can afford less spending. And finally, the world too is sensitive by interest rates. Higher interest rates means less net exports. The export story is a little more complicated, so let's go through it. When there's higher interest rates in your country, foreign savers will send money into the US to take advantage of those higher returns. This will increase the demand for dollars relative to other currencies, and when a demand curve shifts right, the price goes up. The price of the dollar is measured by the exchange rate now rises, it's more expensive, and therefore from the perspective of the rest of the world, buying goods created in America have now become more expensive. American goods are less attractive, the rest of the world buys less exports. So let's put this all in a graph together. On the vertical axis we have the real interest rate, and on the horizontal axis we have each of these components of GDP. There is a negative relationship. When the interest rate goes from 5% down to 2%, the opportunity cost of spending goes down, and therefore consumption increases from 8 to 10 in our made-up numbers. Investment is far more sensitive to interest rates, so when it goes from 5 to 2, we can see a massive increase in investment. Government expenditures are less sensitive. It's mostly dependent on a political process, which is affected by the macroeconomy, but not in the same amount as a market. And net exports also have that negative relationship, but they're a very small component of GDP. Speaking of GDP, to get the whole thing, we need to add this up. So add up all the consumption, the investment, the government exports. We're going to add them up horizontally, and we'll get the investment savings curve, or what we lovingly call the IS curve. Now, as we saw, interest rates affected every component of aggregate spending, C plus I plus G plus NX. But because investment is the most sensitive, that's what it gets named, the investment savings curve. And it links the real interest rate with real GDP. And so when the interest rate's 5%, real GDP is equal to 8 plus 2 plus 3 plus 1. And likewise, when the interest rate drops to 2%, the economy grows to 10 plus 5 plus 4 plus 1.5. Or 19.5. Again, these numbers are made up, but you get the idea. Our next conceptual step is to split GDP into two components, the long-run component and the short-run component. We're going to call long-run GDP or long-run growth the potential output, and we're going to call the short-run fluctuations business cycles. The economy is not always operating at full potential. We often live below our potential. The actual GDP is what we see. This is the measured GDP every year. But potential GDP is an official estimate. It is what we'd see if we were using our entire productive capacity. What do we mean by that? There is no unemployment. There is no idle capital. Everything's running at top speed. We don't have empty buildings. All supply-side capacity is being used up. Here we have a graph of actual GDP in blue and potential GDP in red. Both series, as you can tell, have been adjusted for inflation using the GDP price deflator. Let's zoom in on the past 20 years, and we can see sometimes the economy is running a little hot, as it did in 2007 or in 2019, or for one quarter at least in in 2021, but then during a recession and in the recovery afterwards, the economy can operate below potential, meaning we have unused resources. For the purposes of this model, we want to look at that gap, that output gap, that space between the potential and what we're actually seeing. That gap is going to tell us about business cycles. Likewise, the Federal Reserve frequently talks about this potential GDP or this output gap.
That there looks like there is a permanent hit to the path of potential output for the economy.
Assessments of the potential or longer-run growth rate of the economy have declined. We want the potential output of the United States to be as high as it can possibly be. You've still got a very strong growth well above the longer-run potential output of the economy. You've got
when the output gap was less than a third of the 1.9 trillion, so it was
potential output, potential output. Long-run GDP growth comes through greater productivity, capital accumulation, education, technological growth. But short-run GDP cycles are driven by other forces. The economy is running too cold in a recession or too hot with inflation, and it will require different policies to address it. Another way of looking at it is isolating that gap. So here we have actual GDP minus the potential GDP. So if the number is positive, this is the output gap is positive, and if the number is negative, the output gap is negative and we're underneath potential. This is what we're going to have our short-run macroeconomic model focus on. So instead of having total GDP on this axis, we're only going to have the short-run fluctuation portion or the output gap. This is because our model is going to focus on business cycles. It's not going to focus on that long-run economic growth. And then we're going to make one last modification to this. Rather than measuring the output gap in terms of billions of dollars, the actual GDP minus the potential GDP, we're going to do it in percentage units relative to potential GDP. So we have to divide by potential GDP and multiply by 100 to get it in those percent units. And now, for example, if the interest rate is 5%, we could have a negative 2% output gap, meaning we're in a recession, we're below our potential. And if the interest rate gets lowered, that output gap can go to 0%. That means actual GDP is equal to real GDP and we're living at potential. Well, we're just getting started. We've got two variables and one curve, real interest rate and the output gap. In the next video, we need a curve to help determine where interest rates come from in the first place.